Hello, everyone. For those of you just joining us, welcome to the Radical Exchange Annual Conference. Our next session is Ways of Worldmaking, Recognizing Possibilities. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Charlotte, to introduce yourself, the panelists, and begin our session.
Thank you. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, or for the last more than 24 hours and ongoing. My name is Charlotte Kent, and as the moderator, I actually want to start with a very brief sketch about how the arts contribute to conceptualizations for world making before I introduce the panelists and we get started. So Norbert Wiener, whom we all know as the founding father of cybernetics, invoked the ideas of the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud and the philosopher Henry Bergson on time and motion, which both of them had actually derived from film and photography. Those arts and techniques gave Wiener alternative models to think through issues of memory and interaction. 10 years after viewing time-lapse photography, Freud was conceptualizing a model of the mind and of the formation of dreams that in some ways paralleled the film apparatus that the Lumiere brothers had invented. And Bergson was reconceptualizing perception away from a bifurcated subjective and mediated position to make perception be durational, one with an emergent past and a future, such that thought was not static, but always in process. And that's the way he saw film transform the image. So in this way, early theories of computing and interface engaged heavily with the fantasies of film and photography as graphical and recording apparatus to construct systems that reimagined the recording, storing, retrieving of information, as well as the management of excess stored material. So cybernetics, which Wiener defined as the scientific study of control and communication in the animal and the machine, was a progenitor for fields like artificial intelligence, systems theory, and computer science, though its notions spread across the social sciences too, in part due to the Macy's conferences. Finance, government, urban planning, healthcare, and much, much more were redesigned by the principles of abstraction, quantification, feedback, probability. So the large portions of the world in which we live are indebted to these transformative ideas. But what's important to recognize is that many of these ideas were inspired by insights on and in the art's use of technology. So I offer this sketch here to introduce the ways that creative practices can become really influential, even so far as to determine ways of thinking in fields that then determine the fabric of our lives. The creative projects that these artists and designers are presenting reveal practices as well as content that can offer insights into alternative structures, plausible futures, ways of being in the world that we need to produce sooner rather than later. Our panel takes its title from the 1975 book by the philosopher Nelson Goodman, Ways of Worldmaking, in which he analyzed how we create worlds in the arts and sciences, revealing that, and I quote, "World making as we know it always starts from worlds already on hand. The making is a remaking. A world sticks around until we have the determination and skill to remake it into a new one, when we are willing to examine how the grip of habit enables the stubbornness of fact." So as Matt Pruitt and Jennifer Lynn Morone said in their opening remarks for this conference yesterday, we live in exceptional moral urgency, and nothing about this is easy. And some of the presentations we're going to have today are about trying to investigate that. So our panel is going to begin with a general discussion about world making and how it alters the forces of habit, engenders collaboration, moves past endless critique. And then the second half, the presenters will actually each discuss their own individual projects, and we'll have time at the end also for a conversation about some of the commonalities, the distinctions, and the goals across these sometimes very different projects. So before I introduce the panelists, I just want this. I ask you to remember, as Nelson Goodman said, worlds are made not only by what is said literally, but also by what is said metaphorically. And not only by what is said literally or metaphorically, but also by what is exemplified and expressed, by what is shown as well as by what is said. So to introduce our panelists, y'all can wave if you want to indicate who you are. Rori Knudtson is an artist, architect, and writer working with installation, sound, film, and performance in questions that seek to pragmatically engage architectural, technological, and economic theory. She is the founder-director of Infinite Seed, a decentralized entertainment world-building ecosystem that incentivizes people to adopt new behavior patterns. Tony Lai is a lawyer and researcher, advising and working with companies, government agencies, law firms, and nonprofits to build the future of trust, transactions, and dispute resolution. He is founder of the blockchain group at CodeX, Stanford Center for Legal Informatics, and he's the founder of the company legal.io to deploy technology to scale legal access worldwide. He'll be discussing the project Earth 2030, a collaboration with Primavera de Filipi, who could not join us today. Jennifer Lynn Morone is CEO of Radical Exchange and a multidisciplinary visual artist and activist whose work focuses on the human experience in relation to technology, economics, politics, and identity, and the moral and ethical issues that arise from such systems. Jennifer will be talking about The Scheme of Things, a collaborative world building and storytelling project where participants contribute to a never-ending film of the world we want. Christopher Roth is a film director, producer, screenwriter, and editor. His film Bader was awarded the Alfred Bauer Prize in 2002. Retrofuturistic research, 80 by 81, resulted in 13 books and over 20 theater performances. He will discuss Project 2038, to be presented next year at the postponed Venice Biennale as Project 2039. And Liam Young is a speculative architect and director who operates in the spaces between design, fiction, and futures. He is co-founder of Tomorrow's Thoughts Today, an urban futures think tank. His world building for the film and television industries has been acclaimed in both mainstream and architectural media. He has published several books, including Machine Landscapes, Architectures of the Post-Anthropocene, and has taught internationally. And I'm Charlotte Kent. I'm a professor of visual culture and head of visual studies at Montclair State University, and my research focuses on the absurd as a break with tradition for radical re-engagements with our world. I'll be moderating. So thank you, everyone. I want to start actually by asking, what are some of the different areas that you think world making needs to emphasize in our current moment? There are plenty.
A shared goal? Or trying to identify one?
Yeah, it's hard to, I mean, it's hard to kind of be specific where I think principles of world making actually apply so universally. But I guess what we're interested in doing with our work and what I'll try and introduce a little bit in my presentation later on is that I think a critical role of world making right now is to provide a counterbalance to prevailing media narratives and to talk about, I guess, stories that exist on the periphery of dominant discourse and to find ways to bring them to the surface, either to reveal hidden truths or to start to talk about the subcultural implications of certain technologies, or to think about the ways that we can foreground discussions with groups that up until now have been marginalized. So I think there's a real task for the world maker right now to find ways to amplify discourses and stories that for whatever reason have existed on the edges before now.
I really agree with that. The point I wanted to bring up in terms of world making was this notion of authority and how we can play with that in this current moment, given sort of the origins of the word come down to authorship and the ability to tell your own story. But I think in this moment when we can maybe be starting to question notions of authority or what deserves authority, who deserves to be heard, and who deserves to have a chance at writing their own story, as part of these new worlds that we're entering, where again, stories are very, very capable of being written for us, I think, with increasingly powerful weapons.
Yeah, just take police reform or dismantling the police or demilitarization, like all of these things. What's at the heart of our differences and whatever we think about that is fear. And with world building or world making and storytelling, you can start to get into understanding what's in somebody's mind if they try and tell you both what is a world without the police as I know it look like, and what do I fear that is, and what does somebody else want that to be. And I think that especially in this moment, if we use tools of world making and scenarios and stories, then we can maybe start to express what we're thinking instead of just shouting differences at each other.
So,
I think in many ways that, we see the imaginary worlds as sites to prototype new ideas, new cultural practices, right? And now more than ever, that's kind of what we need to be doing is presenting alternative visions of the futures we all want to inhabit, and trying them out, like so much in the space that we typically occupy, which is looking at emerging technologies. These systems arrive to us, I talk about them as before culture technologies. They arrive to us faster than our ideological or cultural capacity to understand what they might mean. They arrive to us at a pace because the funding streams means you need to monetize these systems quite quickly. So they arrive to it at a point that they can be sold to us, not at the point where we've collectively understood that these are productive systems that we want to introduce into our world. So the practices of world making in fictional worlds create a kind of a safe place to test out and prototype these ideas to see what sticks, what works. And then hopefully it's a way of kind of rapidly exploring the consequences, unintended and intended, of these systems so that we can work back and collectively decide on the futures that we all want to inhabit together.
The important thing there, though, is who's doing the world building and who's paying for the world builders to do the work. So
yeah, totally.
And it's also where you take it to. I mean, prototyping is really what we do, but how do we test these prototypes, or how do we get them out of our kind of universes and make them more resilient and more kind of robust? Or how do we test if they can coexist? Because it's all, world making is always so nice when it's happening in academia or somewhere, but then when it gets into reality, then it gets really interesting, I think. And then what's happening then with the worlds, and do they? Yeah, I think coexisting is something we should always test.
I just wanted to make one note, if that's okay, in regards to thinking I think a lot of the role that's even shifting in world making is for those of us who are doing this kind of behind the curtain, so to speak, there has to be a deliberate, an intentional, possible re-examining of how we do this also. When you start to hand over the script to the people who are actually going to be existing in these realities in the near-term future, I think that a big part of work needs to allow humanity to remember what they knew already and how to imagine, like when we were children, to be honest. I think a lot of the problems we see are this conditioning, generational and societal conditioning, and it could be in the family, it could be in your own community, that almost in a way handicaps the everyday person from understanding that they do have the ability to imagine what they used to. They already knew a long time ago,
So I have a couple questions. Thank you for all of those comments. One of the things that comes out is, of course, that's part of what's important about the world making you all are doing, is this prototyping, is this storytelling. And, as Jennifer started to allude to, who's telling the story? Where are your stories coming from? And so one of the things I wanted to ask you all is, where are your stories coming from? How do you, both individually and more sort of abstractly, manage to constantly break down the barriers of your own storytelling realm to make sure that you're not unintentionally, as it were, building up conceptual walls that feed back to you how good your own story is?
Shall I go first, or who wants to? Well, when I'm just a part of the project, the scheme of things, a very small part actually. I feel a bit more like a facilitator, and I have my own little bits, and but mostly I had started out initially to do a story on my own, and then that just didn't feel very comfortable. And so I did an open call with the organization Morone, the institute, who has been commissioning the project. And so it's been a continual collaboration around a workshop, trying to ask people what they want to change in the world. The scheme of things started as a post-work world question. And so to me, it's really like involving everybody else and getting us to discuss these questions together, and starting with, what are your values? And now, even over the course of this conference, Tony, Primavera, and I have also started collaborating. And, it's like losing authorship completely. It's just becoming this expansive, that's why I wanted all of you on the call as well, in this panel, because the more that we connect on what kind of world we want, I think the more real it can become. So mine is more others' visions and voices than my own.
Maybe I can add that that's the way I work as well. And the 2038 thing is also like that we travel a lot, or we traveled a lot, and just collected voices. And then we I love talking heads. I mean, this was pre-Zoom, like I already started pre-Zoom 10 years ago, things like that. And I like when people talk, and even if they don't talk, I make them talking in editing. And this is how this world building functions for me, that I actually go out and collect things, and then I take them back, and then I try to focus on things, and maybe put them. That's maybe the thing where some writing starts. That you find connections in that.
Yeah, I guess our practices are fairly similar. I obviously have a futures practice here in Los Angeles that's connected to the entertainment industry, but at the same time, I also have a documentary studio called Unknown Fields that I run out of London with another designer, Kate Davies. And for the most part, all of our speculative work begins in that documentary practice, where I would say my methodologies of world making is really a process of exaggerating the present. So Unknown Fields travels around the world to a whole series of kind of really critical sites, and for the most part just listens. And then through the capacities that we have as storytellers and filmmakers, really we're just trying to amplify those voices and extrapolate and extend them into possible worlds, and just kind of play them out and see where they might end up. So although the final project might be quite speculative and unfamiliar, they all begin with a deep examination of the present moment and are extrapolated from there.
I'm working very similarly also, in that Spire, the science fiction feature that I'll present later, was born from a documentary film, and the two films are actually married to each other. I couldn't have one without the other. So the real stories infuse my ability to create fictional characters projected a century from now. But I really couldn't have written a science fiction feature set 100 years from now with all the technological advances that we're anticipating happening without having these real stories connected to real people and real initiatives and real contexts also. And so it's become a really beautiful space of blurring this boundary between how do you solve the problems and actually, I hate to say this, kill the bad guys or kill the bad ideologies, maybe, through fiction, but it's real that you can do that when you have the power as a writer, which I find profoundly empowering as somebody who's always worked with real narrative and real communities with architectural work and film. It's liberating, to be honest. It's like, write it into reality the way you want to see it. But I think also there's a note here too on the fictional aspect too that's really, I think it's better to, in many ways, to show rather than tell. And I think this is where the medium is so powerful. And we've seen that accelerate, obviously, with the increase of videos being shot and posted on social media of the injustices that were always going on.
I mean, all of this seems very much in keeping with this notion of the making is a remaking, right? And so that's I think it's one of the interesting challenges is the way in which, all of you have to investigate the present so much in order to be able to present a future or to conceptualize what might be next. And in that sense, it really does become a kind of a conceptual project, a philosophical endeavor in terms of imagining from where we are now into, as I can't remember who put it, but like thinking through the steps to be able to imagine where this could take us. And I'm just wondering, do you ever find yourselves as you're working through these steps, as you're conceptualizing, finding yourself against the dark roads, the places you don't want us to go or you don't want to take your audiences? And how do you make those decisions? How do you make the decisions not to show, or do you actually sometimes show, this is what happens if you extrapolate in this direction?
I have a lot to say, but I don't want to be the first. I don't want to cut anybody off.
Well, I mean, for storytelling, you need drama and crises and, but then you kind of show how you fix it. So it's the classic thing. I mean, it's always, the drama is always the hero goes deeper and deeper into the shit. So you can kind of take that for everything and then you rescue it. And then, I mean, not you rescue it, but something or an idea or something. So you can, if you look at the others, not the 3-act structure, but you look at the other storytelling thing, the hero's journey, when you go into the unknown. I mean, this is actually what we do. And how do we solve the challenges? And so you have to be a little bit dystopian. You just shouldn't feel too well in dystopia and try to get out of it.
Yeah, you could also, what I try to do is to say, like, we have enough human problems that no matter what we fix and make the world, the whole structural system the way we want, we're not perfect and we're never going to be perfect. We're still going to have love and hate, and we're still going to have to deal with things like, even if everybody has all the help they need to raise children and it's not a stressful situation, but you still have choice, it still comes down to like this inequality of the body and what a woman can do and what a man can't do and who gets to choose what to do with that, That's still hard. And that's still something that we might not solve. So there's loads of things to try and put as conflict. It doesn't have to be that this technology is going to destroy us. We can say, we want this technology, or we want our community to be this way, and show that in solving the conflict. So that's my approach.
Yeah, I mean, like in the last few years, we've been describing our films as productive dystopias, in that there's some redemptive potential in the cautionary tale as a form to describe what might happen if we continue down a certain road. And I think there's certainly value there, and these kind of productive dystopias certainly play well in a kind of accessible and public space, because as Chris was describing, they lend themselves to drama and kind of traditional Western hero's journey style narratives. But more recently, as the world lurches into a real-time live-action dystopia of its own, I don't know, I think that there is the necessity to tell different kinds of stories. And that's more of a challenge as a writer or storyteller, to find the narrative arcs and the dramatic impulse in an aspirational world. And that's what our more recent project, not the ones I'm going to show in a few minutes though, but our current work that's a bit too fresh to start talking about, is trying to project, I don't know, visions of a future that we want to be a part of, as a means to then kind of work back from that endpoint to see what are the things that we need to start to set in motion now in order to get there, or at least to have a kind of a common discourse around these visions. So yeah, I do think there's space for productive cautionary tales, but I also think there's an urgency for telling different kinds of stories that are more hopeful.
I can see why Jennifer was so excited to have us all on this panel together now with her. Liam, I mean, I 100% resonate with that, in the sense that the people who are telling my stories are renowned for invariably looking always on the shadow side, the dark side. What's going to go wrong? I'm talking about lawyers, and and not just lawyers, but policy makers as well. And policy in their own sort of category of world making and telling stories, and often they're fearful stories to sort of push the electorate or their constituency to move in a certain direction based upon their own visions of politics, and there's others that are seeking these hopeful visions. But I think the interesting piece in particular right now is that intersection of the law, the policy, and the technology, certainly from those who are telling the stories in this world, and trying to combine that together into a hopeful sort of narrative. Because I think, yes, there are a lot of these dystopian narratives for how you can go off the deep end. Classically, you're, on the one hand, you're 1984, and on the other hand, you're Brave New World. It's sort of, are you killed by that you feel, killed by that you desire, right? And I think sort of finding that middle line, as it were, is that much tougher job. But I think, there might be a there, and trying to unpack that, I think, is a really interesting thing right now, when we have these sort of feedback mechanisms that can play into these kind of systems of world making that are, in a sense, not just the showing and telling, but the building as well. But how does storytelling relate to, how do good and bad stories relate to that actual process of belief system creation that gets embedded within these systems that govern us?
So that actually leads me, I'm going to pull one of the questions that our audience has sent us, because it's one of the things that you all are sort of talking around is the way in which you are working with concrete stories. We are going out, collaborating with others, getting footage, stories, information, faces, right, to give you some content. But on the other hand, you're really grappling with a set of ideas that are abstracted, as it were, from these concrete tales. And Sebastian asked the question, as a professor of philosophy, that he'd be interested in your thoughts on how philosophy itself could be more closely linked with current tech developments and thinking those through. And I think this is a question that many philosophers often have. It's like, it can feel like their work is sometimes too far removed, when really what they're trying to address is actually the things that seem to matter so much to all of us. So that's Sebastian's question. And I'm just wondering if anyone has things that they've wished or hoped for that from philosophy and philosophers.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll take that. I mean, potentially, our work exists in this space where we're engaging with emerging technologies. One of the films I'm going to show is Where the City Can't See, which is a narrative told from the perspective of a driverless car, seen through LiDAR scanners, which are the ways that driverless cars see and navigate the world. And we spent a lot of time researching the coding that's going on in order to get driverless cars to start to make its own decisions about safety and obviously the kind of the now kind of iconic trolley car question that's being asked, like what are the moral imperatives of a driverless car careening out of control. And it's interesting that the engineers working through these systems are actually making really deep philosophical choices. Like they're coding into these systems, the idea of what constitutes a body, because the car has to recognize bodies in certain ways of certain ages and make certain decisions based on that. What is the body different from a tree, different from a van? And really, like at the core of those questions is what constitutes the human, and trying to encode that into a really dumb rule system. And it's interesting to think what it means to have a philosopher sitting next to the engineer, or from our perspective is what does it mean to fundamentally rethink the role of the engineer and actually encode within the institutional models that produce engineers a way of thinking about ethical questions, moral questions, and questions that normally are cited in philosophy. What does it mean for an engineer to be doing a whole series of required courses across their degree, taught by philosophers, where they start to exist in a space between culture and technology? I think these are really critical things that we should be thinking about now. And we need to be rethinking our institutional models through which technologies start to evolve to open them up to these kinds of questions and thinking as an essential part of them.
I've been trying to build in this philosophical questioning to the actual process of the project and have it appear. I don't know if that really answers the question. I was a bit confused by the question, and with the scheme of things, it's not necessarily focusing on a technology and telling it a story around that technology. It's a fictional story about a person in the world that the author or authors kind of either combine or create together, or it's their individual world that needs to fit with everybody else's. And these, since we work together and we have discussions, we have these philosophical discussions, and a lot of them don't have answers, like Liam and Tony have been saying. Or even if you have a philosopher sitting next to you, do you want them to make that decision or that decision? It's like, maybe they feel like, just give it to the algorithm because I can't decide. Like, this is not a question I want to answer. And what I like to do is I like to leave those discussions in the work and let them enter in there as non-solvable, or we need to always work on this and we need to question this. And when we have something that we're trying to solve that's hard to solve, is it worth having that problem as well?
I want to suggest too that, I mean, if we want to prototype interdisciplinary work, we actually really have to start doing it as Jennifer states. And I also agree with Liam that we need a whole overhaul in institutional models, because the philosopher is required to churn out so many papers per year, per whatever, due to the silo that they're embedded inside of. And that doesn't really leave a lot of space to work with an engineer or a group of artists, and actually that thus far has not been really taken as relevant to their practice and their body of work. And it's a big problem. Because you can think outside that box and want to slip over, but at the end of the day, you got to keep your job. It's all troublesome. And I mean, the same for me coming from the art world or architecture. It's like, why the hell would you want to work with film? Or why would you be interested in blockchain and crypto and blah, 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 blah. It's like, well, I couldn't understand it unless I engaged with it and started to do it and learn it, and fall on my face like crazy trying to figure out the whole bro culture and startup space. It's, but I needed to step in those places to understand it truly in my own body and then to be able to actually operate with a knowledge that's completely somatic and also experiential. That's been my learning process, through a lot of this. But yeah, the siloed spaces are really problematic.
One of the things that really resonates there is this notion of the somatic experience and actually jumping on it. About 10 years ago, I was lucky to be part of the team setting up StartX, which is the Stanford Startup Accelerator. Completely non-profit. We were set up as an educational initiative, but a big target was PhDs, professors, graduates, folks who might not otherwise be in that sort of traditional category of sort of entrepreneur, but wanted to build a world, wanted to build a story, tell a story. And we strove to bring in a lot of different disciplines as part of that, because we didn't have any financial interest in their outcomes. It was more about building that community. But what this makes me think, though, is targeting more philosophers in a sense, and then sort of the corollary is sort of bringing more philosophers into boards of directors. Because asking the right questions. I mean, right now, when tech ethics and the ethics of using AI in the legal system is a very salient issue for me right now. But as part of court decisions and the bias that can be embedded within that, we need philosophers at the table to be talking through, as well as like the jurisprudence experts, the lawyers, and the technologists who are developing that, really helping to be asking those right questions. And judges might say, we're philosophers enough, but I think it is breaking down those silos and seeing what you don't see. That is there's a really key part of that, and yeah, definitely welcome more philosophers to the table.
But in a way, we also, I like this questions and leave discussions open. But at a certain point, when you build worlds and you write stories, there should be also options. And that's when I come back to this, what I said in the beginning, it's very easy always for artists and all these people to say, I only have questions and there are so many possibilities, and see you next year, in 2 years in the next biennial. And then it's never an answer, because if we don't start trying to give answers, even wrong answers, but we have to, a real discussion is actually trying to say it's this or this or this, and not saying, oh, here's the philosopher, here's the guy who makes the self-driving cars, here's this. Who answers this? So I
want to push back against that, because I think there's a lot of people out there who are vying to give you answers. And I think the more important thing that we might be trying to help people get to is coming to their own answers, asking the right questions so that they can come to those answers. And certainly, yes, have guides out there, but cultivating that ability to have that self-authorship, I think, is the key to what philosophers, and Buddhists and, all of the great religions maybe, really drive down at. I think that's part of the storytelling beauty, and the magic of that is actually, opening up your vistas. And yes, maybe there are some solutions and vignettes, but hopefully they're not the utopia we should be striving for. It's my way, and this is the way, sort of thing. But creating like
solutions. I'm not a solutionist, but kind of trying to build systems and whatever, it's moving, it's viable, it's adaptable, all that, but not always pulling back and saying, oh, let's leave it with the questions in a way. I think that's, and always these plenty of possibilities. But at a certain point, I think you have to go for something. And even if it's wrong, you kind of have to test it in reality,
So this makes me think, actually, speaking of philosophers, Bertrand Russell is the great example of a philosopher who kept changing his mind, right? And he was really penalized for that. That was something philosophy still takes issue with him. One of the things that speaking to these disciplinary silos and the way in which they are world making, right? They are worlds in and of themselves that establish the criteria and the ways of being. And one of them is that once you have an idea, you can't ever let it go. And so one of the things, before because I do want us to actually get a chance to look at your specific projects and like talk about them individually, but just before we do, I wanted to ask, like, how do you posit something? Because I think each of you do posit in your world making. And then how do you reconcile having to move on? In other words, how do you as world makers do something, commit to it enough to put in hours of your time, years, resources, family and friends, pain and gain, and the whole process, and then say, yeah, okay, so yes, no, maybe, but not good enough, next, right? Like, how do you do that?
Therapy? No.
They're just thinking, like, I've never said it.
It's a really great question, because, right, at one point you say enough is enough is enough. I've gone through that in this project numerous times. And then always when I'm about ready to throw in the towel, the right person shows up or something magical happens. And you have to be open to those channels of communication that are beyond the physical materiality also. And I think it's really real. I mean, if you're compelled to stay on this track, your passion, whatever, madness, mental illness, whatever, it's like there's something bigger that's pulling you along. And I think what's really gorgeous now is it feels like there's a real ability to start connecting with like-minded others in ways that never were happening before. And yeah, that's been my experience. I've almost quit so many times. Yeah.
It's not a job,
It's not a job. Yeah.
Do it anyway. Yeah. And then maybe somebody's going to give you money for what you're trying to do. It's like a way of thinking and breathing. And I've tried to remember when I was younger, and I was told, was it a famous pianist gave up playing the piano for like 10 years, and then he just goes back. It's like you try and fight with, why am I doing this thing? Or, can I just have a normal life and relax? It doesn't work out like that. I don't know how it is for Liam and Christopher and Tony.
There are also different types of projects, right? Like there's some long-term worlds that I know I've made a film for one particular project or a commission, but I know that I'm going to come back and revisit that world, and that's going to be a book at another point or something else, or I'm going to take those same themes that I didn't quite kind of nail it on that first iteration, so I'm going to apply it to the next project that's coming in. And so there are real slow burners, but at the same time, I think one of the potentials of creating imaginary worlds is that it's much faster to build a fictional one than it is to remake the real one. So I think rapidly prototyping these worlds and launching them out into the physical worlds with enough force that they find traction is kind of important, and to then quickly spin on a dime and make another one, and to find ways that the worlds that you're doing are relevant and capture the present moment. I think is important. It's something that we always do with our work, I mean, with Unknown Fields, we've got a project, a film called The Breast Milk of Volcanoes, which is about the lithium mining industry. And we started to do that project literally the day after Elon Musk got on stage and launched his Tesla Powerwall battery and presented this vision of a green energy future was going to solve all of our problems. Of course, never really talking about where all the raw material to make this future is going to come from. So we booked a few plane tickets and went out and found it. And then launching that film at a moment when it was meaningful and relevant, and that discourse was still in the ether and on the airways was important. And now the conversation has slightly shifted, and that project was of its moment and time. And I think that's kind of enough. And now we kind of look at where that conversation has moved to, and we try and make work in that space. And it's still continuing the same story arc. But I do think there's a way of being relevant that leans into the potential of rapidly producing fictional worlds.
I love this notion.
It's the only. Oh, sorry, Tony. Go ahead.
I was just going to build off that in the sense that there being different kinds of projects and how heavily you posit something, and then moving on from that can play out in different ways. And I'm just thinking in my music brain, there's nothing I enjoy more than sort of a jam session, and you're constantly positing things and constantly they're constantly going wrong, and that's part of the joy of it. And when you do drop into it, there's this magic moment. And that's the word that you mentioned, rapid prototyping. A mentor of mine, Tom Chi, talks about rapid prototyping in that sense. He was the founding product director at Google X and sort of did a whole bunch of these moonshots. And, again, just world making or storytelling in that sense of building something, but just rapidly prototyping. Now he's doing moonshots for the planet, as it were, and has focused all his energies on climate action. But again, it's sort of putting things out there and then seeking that magic moment when sort of people's eyes sort of spark up. And until you get that, sort of just, he's ruthless, just let things go. And, but then to your point about when you really do land on something that you feel is deeply important and it's starting to grip people, I think that, yeah, it's very hard to move on from that. And it becomes a thing that engulfs your life.
My magic moment is always while editing, and then everything comes together, the music and the voiceover and the text and something. And then if a few seconds work, that's a magic moment. And you feel that works. Oh my God, it's so great. And I love it so much. I mean, it's not when you shoot or I almost forget all the time what I shot. And when I talk to people, I always think, oh my God, that was not good and it was boring and everything. And then I see it on the screen and did she really say that? Or, and then while editing, it gets better and better and better by itself. And that's the magic moment for me.
So I think we should probably give our audience a chance to see these magic moments you all are talking about. I want you guys to talk about your projects. We have a bunch of questions that I'm going to get to after the presentations that the audience are asking. And why don't we start, actually, why don't we start with, I'm sorry, what?
How long?
Your presentations, about 5 or 7 minutes or so.
Okay.
I can try and wave at you if that helps to make you stop. Okay. But Christopher, I was actually going to say, why don't we start with yours, and Jennifer, you're going to have the video. So Christopher, if you want to make any opening little statements about the project that you're going to present, and then Jennifer can show the video, and then you can speak some more.
We just show the video and then I talk a little bit.
Great.
Thank you. There's no sound. Okay.
You were able to hear, right? Not at first, but after.
Yes, yes. Okay. It's called 2038, and it was supposed to be in this year's German Pavilion in Venice in the architecture biennial. And there were supposed to be only films, so 5 projections with like a history channel. So the world we are in is 2038, and we are in an epoch of new serenity, and it's not paradise. Like Jennifer said before, it's not, we don't solve every problem, and there are still little crises, but it's a much better world. And most of the changes are systemically. So we didn't change people. There are still very bad people around, but the systems on a planetary scale and on a very decentralized local scale work much better together. And in the pavilion should have been 5 projections which go in one direction, and they show cases, they show models, they show news, how we got there. And there was supposed to be one central film, let's say central film, not one main film, but one central film. And this was fiction. And there were 3 people in this fiction, and they were all in 2038. And one was Keller Easterling from New York, and she would be, she is gonna be the president in 2038 of the US. There is Patrick Schumacher, the most famous German architect, let's say hardcore libertarian. He by then is the mayor of London. And there's Wana Bogdan, an architect and a politician. She is a very, let's say, famous architect in Brussels now with a golden business card, but she's also a politician who went back to Romania and founded a party, and they got during the European elections like 35% or something. So it was a big success, but as you know, Romania is not in a good condition politically because the old social democrats are very corrupt, but they are back in business and so on. But she's gonna be, these 3 people are going to be in a hotel room in 2038, and they are okay. They talk, they don't fight, they don't kill each other, and they all said yes to it. So they were all supposed to come in May to Berlin and shoot this 15-minute film. So what the idea of 2038 is not to show what's wrong in the present, but to show how we kind of, which are the models which could work together. So it's very much about coexisting, but it's also very much about, let's say, like a planetary legal system which allows humans and non-humans to coexist. So it's quite big and it's quite idiotic, but some things we don't have to say. So it's not to the last legal thing, a whole thing, you know, how we remember things. If we remember, how did Trump get elected? You know, you can't say, was it Cambridge Analytics? Was it Hillary Clinton's emails or Pizzagate? So when people remember these things, they remember fragments or their opinions and these things. So it will be kind of, or I mean, if we do it next year, it will be 2039. So it's even more. We put a lot of films now online in July. We're gonna come out with a magazine and all these things, but then we do 2009 next year. And it's this kind of backcasting or hyperstition where the future tries to make itself real in a way. So that's what we hope. Thanks.
Thank you, Christopher. All right, well, I want to get to everyone. So Jennifer, why don't you go next?
Okay, that sounds really exciting, Christopher. I can't wait to see more of it. And I probably would have a lot of similar, there's a lot of similarities in a way where the scheme of things, here, let me share my screen. I have a bit of a messy presentation and I have a video, but can you, oh no, you can't see yet. Let me just get this. So how do I do this? Okay, so first I'm just going to go through some slides to give you a little background. Can you see this? Yes. Somebody can see this, right? Okay, so I was doing other work and I was in this criticizing absurd position, trying to make sense of what was happening with data and corporations and the sense of powerlessness. And I made this project called Jennifer Lynn Morone Inc., which was really kind of making fun. It was very satirical, but at the same time, it was also sincere and really trying to find ways of transforming these things, this language as technology and this technology into something that could work for us. And it got often misinterpreted, often well interpreted, by people like yourself, Charlotte, but it still didn't do anything. And it made me think about, what are we doing with the stories that the work we're trying to do when we're trying to make something, to say something as a warning, like Liam said, we need these warnings, but Ian Forster wrote this in 1904, The Machine Stops. And he basically predicted Skype and the internet. And, I don't know if the Industrial Revolution or the Industrial Era goes hand in hand with us both on one side telling dystopias of what's happening because of industry and industry telling us utopias. So I think, and this is kind of a question I would probably ask all of us, have you also felt worried about making something? I feel like myself, it was hard to make a preferable world, to be sincere. And I just took a step and luckily also found out about all of your work and that this is seems to be a common line of thinking at the moment, which is wonderful. So the scheme of things started, like I had said earlier, it is, first the title is about trying to say that everything is connected. We can't change this little thing over here and then, not have anything happen over there. And it's like an ecosystem, our whole world. So I started with a workshop in Rijeka for Drugomore because this project is for the EU Capital of Culture, which has also been postponed but it was supposed to happen in May and now it's happening in August. And so this was in Rijeka and we did an open call and I just had them gather for a few days. And we started with this, let's think about a post-work world, not a future, something that could happen now. What in the world, think about some features in the world that you struggle with, that you have a problem with, or that you would wish would be better or were there. Maybe that, especially in the former Eastern Bloc, like what maybe was better before and isn't there anymore, and how can you combine it or recreate that, or how would you make that work? And I also had them start not from those features only, but from their values. So they had to identify certain values and then go into the features and always try and reposition those and think of a character that would be in this world. Oftentimes characters are similar to ourselves, or they're various versions of ourselves, or we also put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. So here's some shots from the place. And I'm just gonna play this trailer that I made that is not, it's probably not as great as Christopher's, but it gives a sense of the feeling of the film. So it's not, you know, utopia. They're in an old relic, this thing where you can imagine they're having a conversation about children. And like I said earlier, the system supports them. This is a man who loved working. He was a capitalist and now he has no more work. And he's frustrated. That's Marco. And this is Emma, who used to work in the military, and now that doesn't exist anymore. And she's really having to face her reality and her past of what she did for a job. And it gets into systems of circular design and data dignity and, you know, lots of elements that people are just living in. And so these were the details of so like I said, this girl, I won't get into the story details because I don't want to take up too much time. And then with COVID, I still had to do that, and I was still working with Radical Exchange, of course. But, oh, sorry. But I also wanted to open up this process to other people, especially during this time, to try and think about how can we think about, like, actually make sense of this moment, but also imagine something else. This is a perfect time. It's a horrible time, but it's a perfect time to actually pause your reality in a way, because it is paused. When COVID started, lots of people don't have the lives that they had before, and everything is changing so fast. So it's a great moment to think about, well, what do I want? And we've had this big pause button. And so we started doing stories with other people online, and have generated a few already that we haven't shot them or anything, but it's really nice to start expanding outwards. And like I said, today we had Primavera, and Tony and I today and yesterday had 2 workshops. So growing the base to try and get more voices. If you want to find out about the project, I'll let you know. Just write me or Twitter me at jlmorone.com or jlmorone, and I'll you can follow it here, and I'll connect. Let me try and get out of here and stop sharing. So what's really important to me is not so much the work in terms of the film. It's more the act of asking anybody, asking regular people, not specialists, not experts, not the politicians, although we could ask the politicians, the Republicans and the Democrats, what kind of world do you want to live in? But asking, kids, asking mothers, asking regular people, like everybody is really, what we prefer to have and what we need. And then trying to imagine that together. And I really like the film format because you draw other people in. You keep drawing people in as behind the camera, in front of the camera, the people that give you the locations. There's lots of minds that come, and they have to envision this, and you have to do it together, and you have to say, okay, your character is this person, and this person has this problem, and they can identify with that. The hard part is to imagine the world they live in. That's the hardest part. So I think that challenge is exciting, and it's worth doing. So it's the scheme of things.
Thank you, Jennifer. One of the things I'm going to have us all talk about afterwards is the medium and how the medium is significant to the project itself, because I think that that is an important part of what all of you are doing. Jennifer, since you just brought up the project with, and the collaboration you just did with Tony and Primavera, why don't we have Tony speak about 2030?
Thank you. I don't have any slides. I'm just going to describe some of what we've been working on. So I hope that works out okay. So Primavera and I, we both work in this intersection of law and technology, in particular around blockchain. And we've got an interest around this notion of interoperable governance. So a couple of months ago, we held the first of these, what we're hoping will be a series of ongoing workshops and collaborations, which was why we were super happy to be able to have a collaboration with a bona fide world maker in Jennifer. I think I'm really moonlighting as one with my sort of hat as a lawyer, entrepreneur, and now a researcher in this field of computational law. And that's really where Coder's law, classic Lessig, and law is becoming code. And so we're seeing laws and regulations that previously were, in a sense, algorithms executed by humans in various different ways. You sort of go through that, and obviously around that there's this larger notion of a belief system, and I think that's where this sort of world making piece comes in. The challenge right now for us, I think, in this field is actually trying to explain to each of these different groups that we're engaging with at this intersection of law, technology, and policy, these stories, these worlds in languages that they are familiar with, and then ultimately, because policymakers are relating to the entire world and their constituents, how this gets relates out more broadly. So at the initial conference we did, which was an all-day event, we did this interdisciplinary gathering, really, which was seeking to bring together these folks who are working on these projects. And we had a focus on the immediate near-term research and projects that were and still are currently working to put in place the legal and technical governance standards for coordination and sharing of data around pandemic response. So there's contact tracing apps, there were folks who were building out blockchain infrastructure that would sort of support anonymous data sharing, and variously were being currently canvassed. And all of the different risks and challenges that were throwing up, there were a thread of sort of existing stories, and the challenge was sort of how do we tell these positive stories and create these potentials from not just these immediate response needs with a COVID data coordination, but then the immediate next workshop was around climate data coordination, and looking at these similar features and themes and values around the kind of data sharing that we might want, both in relation to this near-term urgent response, but also how it plays out to the sort of this larger climate coordination issue similarly on a global scale. What was really beautiful was that we were able to bring in policymakers who specialized also in gathering voices. And I think this speaks to this notion of authority that I brought up. We had a wonderful current law student, but he's already had a sort of a career in policy, Randall Winston. He had been Jerry Brown's executive director of the Strategic Growth Council, and as part of that had responsibility for looking at some of the effects of climate change and channeling their voices towards where the funds from these climate taxes were going to go. So, trying to learn from some of the carbon tax sort of backlash in other areas, and really sort of looking for their stories. How is it affecting you? How might we do that? So I think policymakers from that perspective already understand it. And then the challenge then was, how can we help this particular intersection of experts tell the stories about what is being enabled by these new technologies? So as part of that, we had folks showing off, Aaron Wright with the Lao, autonomous and automated legal entities. What are the implications of those? Can we look 10 years in the future and tell a story looking back, how these have actually, allowed us to coordinate around climate issues, the whole, caboodle of SDGs, right? And with that, we encourage people to write stories as well as sort of tell those. And so I just want to read a little piece of one that Primavera and I wrote together, which sort of try to encapsulate and get across some of these concepts. I'm going to jump into the middle of the story, but the whole story is up, available to read, and we'll share it. The open source movement that galvanized the internet and the protocols that ensured interoperability among multiple sites had begun to transform education too. Millions joined in building out the open source learning commons, the infrastructure which empowered the people of Leia's world. After the pandemics hit, contributions to the learning commons came in public health. Pandemic response protocols from triage to treatment were constantly updated by volunteer nurses and frontline workers. Areas where learning had been undergoing rapid change benefited particularly from such an open and adaptive approach, epitomized by law and its transformation as a practice into legal engineering. Early that year, after turning 16, Leia, who had always been fascinated by nature and biology, chose to start learning about governance and complex adaptive systems. She had begun gathering the materials and contacting peers and mentors who would help her on her learning journey. Permaculture was her favorite topic, how the complex, interconnected, focusing not only on farming and gardening, it also extended towards the notion of social permaculture, how the complex, interconnected communities of living things, people, animals, or plants can be organized in a broader ecosystem so they all contribute to helping rather than exploiting one another. She could design a sustainable ecosystem for the regenerative agriculture site and was also gaining new knowledge in political theory, legal engineering, and economics at the same time. Anyway, just a little vignette, but that's what we were trying to encourage folks to do and really play out some of these developments like this learning commons for sort of COVID response sharing that nurses were actively using, and this was actually being created. What might that look like in the future? And so, yeah, a little taste of Earth 2030, and we're hopeful to be able to do many more with law schools, with policymakers, but also with artists and world makers more generally, if we can find some magic moments at this intersection.
Tony, great. Thank you so much for that. And the projects are available on the website?
Yes, I'll share around some links to the videos from the last workshop, and I think we'll be putting together a little recap of what we did on the collaboration yesterday and today with Jennifer.
Great, thank you. So just some of the things, just because some of the technology things, I'm wondering, Rory, if you might present Infinite Seed now and Spire in particular.
Yeah, and since we're able to stream, can I stream from a website? Is that possible?
The content might not be quite adequate, so you can try it, but there have been issues in the past.
Yeah, it's at the end, so I just wasn't sure. I mean, I have more. Let me. What am I doing? Share my screen first, right? That would be helpful. Okay. So, full screen mode. I'm working on a PC and I'm kind of lost a little bit. So apologies. Yeah, so this project, the bane of my, no, just kidding. Infinite Seed is an ecosystem. And I'm gonna particularly focus on showing you all, and hopefully a mood trailer that's a little bit dated at the end of this about Spire. But essentially, this is what we are, a decentralized entertainment world-building ecosystem, incentivizing people to adopt new behavior patterns with positive impact on environmental and social disruption. And this project, I have no clue. I mean, I do, but I don't, like how it got so big. It started as a simple sound installation, connecting two mining cities between the United States and Norwegian territory to each other 10 years ago. And I've been working to raise some money to get a grant, and I finally got a grant from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to go to this place. I'd been north of the Arctic Circle in Norway. I've lived off and on there most of my life. But I got this grant to go in 2010 and, got myself up there and landed in this context. It's an area called Svalbard, which if anybody knows, it's pretty much as far north on the planet you can go, but it's like sandwiched right between the north coast of Norway and the North Pole. So I connected the main city there, which is historically was a mining city, and it was when I started working there. It's not anymore. To Denver, Colorado, where this exhibition was, and did it like I did a live sound feed between the two. In real time, I was actually there as the installation was being installed back in Denver in this art space. But when I landed in that place, I was like, holy shit, this place is going to go through so much change in my life. There's no way I can just do this stupid little sound installation. How ridiculous, you know? And so I went back the next year with my kid brother, and a documentary film was born. And I did a couple of more exhibitions in France, Norway, and the US on this, more with these characters I had started to develop of 3 men I met that first time I went up there, that all had a connection to the 3 main economies, and also had a really profound creative practice that were connected to those economies somehow, as human beings, just living their lives. And as I did these other exhibitions, I realized, you know, art smart, who cares, you know, like, this is crazy, like enough, you know, schmoozing in the galleries and patting each other on the back, like, I don't care. So I really felt like, how do we really pass this message along to a greater populace? And me as an American, you know, the largest carbon contributing nation forever, now China, but not taking much in proactive steps towards forward, I decided I had to go to Hollywood. And my kid brother's a filmmaker. So this looks really jaggedy, but essentially we have 4 products that are all part of this ecosystem, and they all developed over time. There was a need. And so my work, pragmatically, research-wise, academically, has always been about how you shift the gaze relationship between the screen and the actual viewer into participatory, not just dialogue, but engagement. And a lot of my work prior to working full-time on this project the last 6 years was in bottom-up city planning initiatives, where we would work with the municipality and the local stakeholders to really develop temporal ideas, to try things out, you know, and fail fast. And that was partially what I was doing when I was teaching at the University of Colorado. And it led to this. I realized if we could actually start showing people the future, that we would have, as we discussed today, that maybe we'd have a bigger chance of actually starting to change the mindset of some people, or at least have them challenge the assumptions that they have. And so Spire is the sci-fi feature that was born from going up to Svalbard that first time. We are completely running this through full-on Hollywood style, except we're more like a Trojan horse because we're in the midst of putting together a slate of films to be financed via cryptocurrency with folks in Switzerland. But trying to find the right people, as I had stated in the discussion earlier, is really important. So I did a lot of like really bad, fall in my face. And there's a lot of bullshit in Hollywood, if any of you know, and there's a lot of like talkers, not doers, a lot of people who've been there, never got there sort of people. And it's really difficult when you come from a collaborative architectural space to understand how you navigate that system. So now we're in good hands. I feel really comfortable. And also for me, what's been really troublesome in this project overall, I'm just gonna say this because this is the reality of making it happen, is working between different nation state jurisdictions and how legalities work, the banking works, and how actually the film production side of things work. So in Norway, it's a very different, very, very different environment than it would be in Los Angeles. I put some slides in here to show you how we were working with mixing the reality with the fiction. So this is Svalbard, and one of the characters in the documentary, he was this beautiful guy. He worked for the Svea mine, which was one of 3 or 4 mining mines for the Norwegian mining company that was operating when I started working up there, which is now no longer. And so he would stow away, you know, he'd go up to his home in Svalbard 2 weeks out of the month, and then go back to his home outside Oslo. And his profound art practice was about cultivating these creative, these really beautiful, exquisite photographs that to me mirrors a lot of what he was doing in the mine. He was an industrial mechanic, so he's fixing the machines. And so the precision is phenomenal in his photographs. And he is kind of like the embodiment of the mechanized soul, like the industrial soul, right? He was born and raised in the most industrial city on the west coast of Norway. And there's something about these photographs, his ability to actually create them, that allows him to thrive. There's one of the abandoned mines up in this area too. This is a really strange context because it's Norwegian territory, but it's internationally occupied, and the Russians have a stake in it also, of course, because you know it's melting now. This is a mine that was abandoned back in the 80s, and we have these 2 factions with the film. There's the good guys and the bad guys, of course, following the typical, you know, hero's journey and the 3-act structure and the story arcs or what have you. So the rebel alliance, so to speak, is where these folks are housed. And the premise of the story is basically 100 years from now, there's a global corporation that controls MSN. Everything. You can think about Amazon, Monsanto Bear, Whole Foods, whatever, Disney, Netflix, all combined into one big corporation that just pretty much controls everything. And people live inside isolated cities that are hermetically sealed, that are inside that system. But there's the rebel faction. Their headquarters is up here in this old abandoned Russian mining town called Pyramiden. And they're cultivating seeds. The current currency in 100 years, or the most sought after currency, is actually reproducible seeds. And I don't have a picture, I don't think, in here. Maybe it's at the end, I can't remember, sorry. The whole story centers around the global seed vault, which is up in Svalbard. If you all have heard about it, it's this mothership seed depository for all reproducing seeds on the planet. Allowed to happen in Norwegian territory because they're not political about this. It's a human right to have access to seeds. And that main mothership seed vault it's fed into by 11 subsidiary seed banks that are managed by an organization called Crop Trust. Most of those seed banks are in the Southern Hemisphere, and then smaller seed banks feed into that. So it's really beautiful. It's like an open source seed sharing. And there's actually an international seed treaty that should instill that we're not having to buy seeds at some point, and that's the only way to get food. So anyway, we based our rebel faction here, but I just want to show you, this is a beautiful place, and how we start world building, as an architect, so to speak, to show where there's us and them sort of scenario of this enclosed world. This is actually set in present day Baltimore, where the coast has changed, and I actually got my conceptual artist to actually take a block from the city and throw this inside the space. This is a really radical story. When I talked about, about to throw in the towel and somebody shows up, is that I had created this, like the equivalent of the Millennium Falcon of the 22nd century, which is this radical, prototype sea vessel that cleans the seas. That it was part of this global corporation, but they decommissioned it because it would have put them out of business. And we've been needing a vessel that's affordable for our documentary crew. And I can talk about that story, maybe some other conference or next year. But I named this ship Freya. And then we found our ship to actually use for the documentary, and it has the exact same name. So we'd actually conceptualized this vessel prior to finding this vessel, which I just think it's kind of really crazy. So there's more on this website. The website's actually being redone as we speak. But I'm going to show, if I can, a little, I think it's less than 2 minutes trailer. This is an old mood trailer from Spire, just to give a little bit of the sort of idea of the world. The first part of it is a little, it's irrelevant now at this point with how the script has changed, but I'll go ahead and play this. Hopefully you guys can hear it and see it.
Rori, we can't see it.
You can't?
No.
Let me make you a co-host. Hold on.
Okay, that's okay. Well, then I won't play it, and maybe there's somewhere I can share this elsewhere. If you go to our main website, you can put in infinitec.is /spire / and you can see it there. So
I think it's also listed in the Radical Exchange partners section. If many of the different art projects have been listed there, and I believe yours is one of them.
Yeah, perfect.
Rori, thank you very much. So with that, Liam, you're going to do, if you wouldn't mind, stop sharing, Rori.
Oh, that would be good, huh? Because you can see my whole desktop. I'm so lost in this computer. I really, stop share. Okay, there we go.
And so next we're going to have Liam, and Liam, you're going to introduce the video, and then there'll be the video about the work.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just reiterating a point I was making before, when we think that a critical role of the worlds that we make is to provide a counterbalance to prevailing media narratives. And we hope that by understanding and exploring the worlds that we make and visualizing these futures, that we may become more critical consumers and producers of our own futures. So really what I wanted to do, just to help the conversation along, was to take you through a series of what I describe as worlds less traveled, which is really a collage of 3 science fiction films that we've made, and a series of kind of clips that talk about some of the context out of which those films emerged, in order to explore the omitted, hidden or forgotten worlds that lie behind the scenes of our dreams of technology. So I'm going to play these films, and I'll be talking over the top and narrating over the top of them. Hopefully that's useful. So if we could play the film now, that would be great. Normally when we talk about the future in film, we see images like this one from Minority Report, where the city is filled with the digital confetti of our desired worlds projected just for us. This is the city that the future promises us. But in our world, I can't see it, but maybe it's coming. Data farms and outsourcing shops where our digital imaginaries are actually produced. Here in India,
while the production team is pulling the video together, panelists, one of the questions from the audience is, where are there places to pursue some of these kinds of world making? Like where are some public spaces where this conversation is happening? How can you get involved? So maybe if you could just have that question in the back of your mind and just start jotting down locations when we come back after Liam's film, then
gone home, he straps on his VR goggles and they walk hand in hand through the streets of a city that he's collaged together for them from scavenged VFX movie models and the leftover 3D assets that remain on Indian studio hard drives after a project is cancelled. Our future is a utopia that exists in the thickness of a screen. In reality, we live out our lives in a virtual city that stretches. Is it coming, or shall I fill an ad lib, or is it imminent? The worlds less travelled that lie behind the clicks and swipes are vast and sprawling. Through the aisles of everything, we're promised automated ease and a sky that is dense with intelligent things. The drones will become as ubiquitous as pigeons. Our packages rain down in an Amazon hailstorm. They will deliver our pizzas. They will walk all of our dogs. Set in the world's less travelled is our film In the Robot Skies, the first narrative film shot entirely through pre-programmed drones. In this story, a flock of drones are used to monitor our behaviour from above, tracking our every move. They control the wayward youth of a London council estate. And we watch as a young girl has hacked and decorated her own drone. And like kids in an old-fashioned classroom, she scribbles notes on the drones and sends it back and forth to her boyfriend, trapped under surveillance in the tower opposite. In this near-future city, drones form both agents of state surveillance, but also become co-opted as the aerial vehicles through which 2 teenagers might fall in love. Another drone, armed with a dildo, disrupts a Russian parliamentary session. And another zips overhead en route to attack a village in a country half a world away. We are being sold a future of smart gadgets, of living objects that listen, watch, and talk back.
In this bizarre Samsung commercial, a smart home creepily brings back to life a woman's dead husband. What are the most appropriate means through which we can have an interaction with a home? Or a warehouse filled with a million objects? Or a city? Set in the world's less travelled is our short film Soul City Machine. And we hear the voice of a real chatbot that we've trained on city datasets and urban management protocols. It's an autonomous city of machines, where the sky is filled with drones, cars are driverless, the street is draped in augmented reality, and everyone is connected to everything.
나는 서울입니다. 만나서 반가워요. 저는 인공도시 시스템입니다. 저는 매 순간 확장합니다. 저는 신생아보다 나이가 많지만 우주보다는 어립니다. 네온 쌓인 달빛 아래에 비친 당신의 헤어스타일이 아름답습니다. 그 피부의 주근깨 같은 신호등은 당신을 향해 윙크합니다. 당신은 나이 들고 밥을 먹고 눈을 깜빡이고 숨을 쉬기도 합니다. 노래를 불러드릴까요?
Our future worlds are typically presented to us through the rhetoric of efficiency and problem solving through technology, and they're marketed to us through cute icons and graphics of the smart city. The management of the city that was once publicly elected is now outsourced to proprietary software systems and public services has disappeared.
Still happening correctly, but
are we a customer or a citizen?
I've got it on my phone. If anybody wants to watch.
And graphics of the smart city. We're endlessly scanned by countless sensors, lasers, cameras, and satellites feeding the city operating system. This, for example, is how certain models of driverless cars see and understand the city, as these 3D point clouds. These are scenes from a science fiction film we have made called Where the City Can't See, one of the first narrative films shot entirely using this same laser scanning technology. Across a single night, a group of young factory workers drift through the future smart city in a driverless taxi. They are part of an underground rave community that work on the production lines by day, but at night, they adorn themselves in machine vision camouflage textiles and the masks of anti-facial recognition makeup, and they dance in the hidden spaces of the city. They reimagine their fashion cycles to follow the rate of Moore's law, the latest phone model or software update rather than a change in natural season. They hack the city, and their iridescent clothes reflect the light of CCTV laser.
He's popping on here, so I'm hearing
creating
him.
exuberant glitches, distortions, and disturbances in the dataset, all the while searching for the wilds that lie beyond the machines. These are all stories that we describe as productive dystopias. Stories that we think are critical in visualizing a future that is complex and nuanced. The future does not rush over us like water. It is something we all must actively shape and define, and these types of stories can help us to start asking more questions of the technologies that are going to define our lives, spaces, and cities. But ideology rarely evolves at the same pace as our technology, and that is one of the roles of the world builder, to prototype the cultural implications of all possible worlds.
And we're back. Thank you, everyone. And Liam, thank you for that. Did you have any closing remarks you wanted to make from the video, Liam?
No, that was it. Apologies to the audience. When we're on our speaker view, we don't actually see the video and what you guys are playing. So we were talking, going, is it starting? Is it on? So that's why you hear us talking over it, because we're we don't see it. But anyway, no, I think hopefully it spoke for itself.
Great. I mean, this is Zoom life, right? I mean, how much time have we all spent being like, can you hear me? Can you hear me? It's been months of that, it seems like. But anyway, getting back to world making, there's a bunch of different commonalities across your different projects, as well as obviously differences. But one of the things I actually just wanted to ask us if we could get to a little bit is one of the things I was talking about at the very beginning, which is the way in which our use of the medium, our use of the technology, the way in which we make art is itself a world-making practice and a way of thinking into a new world. It tells people, not only in terms of content, but in terms of its form, how to think in new ways. And so I'm wondering, since we're talking about technologies and we're talking about that, if you could just talk a little bit about your practices and how you're working with technologies to also try and get some of those ideas across.
I was just going to piggyback on that also, and one of my questions is really wanting to know from the others too, in regards to how you establish, what audience you're speaking to, because that's one of the things I think as artists, it's amazing to bring people into our world. It's really hard to do that a lot of times too, because it's a lot of people don't feel that it's accessible. They don't know how to enter it. And so I am curious about that from the group as well, because as we move forward in this world that we're all wanting to see, it seems really important that the ability to tap into the material and the content, the questioning, and the solution making is really defining audience, I think, is super important.
My particular audience is, as I was mentioning earlier, somewhat not used to the notion of taking risks and putting themselves out there, and I think part of the job of world making, as we've been talking about, is having to posit something that is very much going to be shut down in various different ways. The public spaces where, just as part of this pushing towards this willingness to put oneself out there, is a global community called Legal Hackers. There's chapters in over 160 places around the world right now. And it's really drawing out and creating a public space that is amenable to lawyers and policymakers and technologists to come together and hack, i.e. create and unleash some creative potential. And I think this speaks to the broader hope that there is an artist in all of us. Even if we go into very, very rigid, structured professions or practices, the ability to find and create a space where you can be alongside other people to unleash your creative potential is part of the hope for both the legal hackers movement as a whole, and what with Earth 2030 we're trying to create in a very specific sort of governance realm. But that sort of speaks to this somewhat utopian notion. I think that we've all got that spark in us that is just sort of waiting for that right venue to be sort of given voice to.
Yeah, I mean, just to come in on the question of audience, I'm trained as an architect, and don't know, I think a lot of the things that architects and urbanists talk about are actually really important, but typically the discipline does so through very coded sets of documents, plans and sections, or we celebrate and publish books that maybe have a print run of 500 to 1,000 copies. We talk to other architects in dark lecture halls. The reason that we've transitioned out of that space, and I also run a master's program in Los Angeles in fiction entertainment at SciArc, an architecture school, is to help those kind of conversations from an architecture or design or urban discipline to get out into the world and to connect to audiences that aren't normally part of a design discourse. So it's also why I moved to Los Angeles, to sort of co-opt the mediums of popular culture and to inhabit the spaces of the Hollywood entertainment machine with those same critical ideas. And we talk about it, I think it was discussed before, but we also use the metaphor of the Trojan horse to encode within, a blockbuster film, critical ideas about an aspirational future world. In my own films, kind of work in more an art space or a music video space, for instance, but we do world building for much larger TV and film productions, and the same methodologies that we use on our own short films apply in that space, deliberately trying to get these ideas that we think are interesting out in forms that are much more accessible. And I think, that's something that's part of the power of world making, is being able to reach audiences in that other forms can't.
To add to that, what Liam said, I teach film in an architecture school in Switzerland. So I'm not trained as an architect, I'm trained as a film director or whatever. And we founded a web TV station where we have different channels, and it's all linear. So you can't stream, you just have to watch what's on. And I like linear television very much because it gets you a little bit out of the bubble. So you can watch what you expect, but then you see something which you didn't expect. And this is like a cooperative platform, and there are more channels coming to it. There's one from Copenhagen coming to it now. So this is kind of how we try to, and we also do TV pop-ups. So we put our TV on websites, which are kind of, we do that with 2038 now. We do that with eFlux together. So people or websites who have a lot of traffic will have our TV on top of it, like a TV hack or a TV pop-up. So to get more audience and get out of the bubble.
And well, the audience, there's two sides. There's anybody's welcome to come in, and co-create. But I want to ask everybody to take off whatever hat they wear in their job, or, if you're making a product, that you take that off your mind and you really approach it first with your values in the world, not putting your product in the world or your creation. And then the audience to talk to, I don't want to say influence, but in a way influence, is when you go back into the reality and pushing what you're doing, and then also for others in those positions as well. So I don't have a very, very niche audience, but I would say I want to give the voice of the many to the ears of the few. And then the question that you had asked, Charlotte, the scheme of things is inherently collaborative, and I find that really difficult. One of the parts of the problem is, getting everybody together, having these bursts of creation, but then it comes to like editing or putting it all together, whose job is that? And doing this in a really co-creative way would be wonderful. And then also making decisions together. I mean, this is something that like Tony, the radical exchange community at large is really skilled at and focused on, and that would be hugely helpful. But this co-creating remotely or not remotely in person, decision making, and yeah, splitting up the work and funding projects so that they can sustain themselves without having to go to Hollywood or, you know, sell your soul.
Well, I mean, we're starting to get down in terms of our time, and the projects, I mean, all of you have made projects that are really complicated and layered and intentionally so. And so, but one of the things that I think I just want to say that I think is sometimes a challenge that, you know, we face, the art world can be incredibly insular, right? And some of the places where we encounter these types of projects can be insular. You hear about them from other people who are already interested in it, that kind of thing. But one of the things that I think is provocative about this moment is that somehow actually, I would argue that because there's increased knowledge about decentralized technology, there's increasingly media productions, and I'm going to call them that, both in terms of the media we might dislike, as well as some of the projects you are working on, that are using this modality and this way of thinking to get out there, right? And I think that that's something that is actually a really positive aspect of what we can see growing, right? In the sense of like, how are all of you sort of working on this idea of world making right now? Like, why is it that there's this collaborative effort to be pushing these boundaries? And so, I mean, I guess if I could just, you know, sort of as a wrap up, sort of ask you if there's any sort of final thoughts you have on the nature of collaboration, on the nature of the fact that we are literally in a decentralized conversation right now, that we are, that we're making decentralized projects as a part of our creative and intellectual endeavors.
I mean, I think this follows with Jennifer's comment about the collaborative process is really, it's really a lot of work because, yeah, you become this, like, the glue, the centerpiece of like keeping all the parts moving, which that in and of itself becomes a full-time job, if not more. I think, you know, the decentralization part is still not a normal conversation every day. I've been back in the States for a little over a year now, and it's like people have no clue what I'm talking about. It like goes right over their head. People that I would think would. So I think as we start to develop more technology that allows distribution to happen and the ways of education, what this is, like nobody, you know, when email came out, did any of us understand how that was working? It's like, and then to describe it to somebody who was an older generation, you know, you write the letter and it goes instantly and it comes back near instant. It's like, you have to put it into analogies of things that are actually relevant in their everyday now and in their past too, I think, to get them to understand it. That to me seems like the big barrier right now. Once we start doing more and getting it out there and distributing, it'll become much more like second nature.
Yeah, I mean, I would also just flag up, like, not to play devil's advocate, but yes, there are extraordinary decentralized platforms, and there is, you know, at least in my kind of film space with kind of animation, visual effects, there's been a democratization of those tools, and more people are able to make content. But when we're talking about audiences of certain scales, mainstream media platforms are still very much large-scale monopolies, and there are still a handful of gatekeepers into those formats. So it's not the decentralized, fertile media ecosystem where everyone can make stuff and get it in front of audiences as fluidly and as without the friction that we might hope. And again, that's why I think there's still, we try and operate to a certain extent from inside that machine a little bit. And it's I mean, I know that's not the way you were framing it, Jennifer, but it's not a selling out at all, but rather it's trying to co-opt those mechanisms a way to try and tell different stories. Like, I don't think Hollywood makes crap because they really like crap. in many cases, there are people in that space for the wrong kind of reasons, and the more that we can start telling meaningful stories in that format, the better. And at the same time, propping up and trying to support these more organic and decentralized systems, I think that's great. But the real platforms for rolling out those forms of content at scale just don't exist. And when they do start to pop up, they're immediately kind of shut down. So it's just a word of caution, I suppose, that there is still much more to be done to try and get people access to both this content, but also to get different voices and authors access to those large mechanisms of production.
I know we're at time right now, but just want to make a note on that, Liam, in regards to Hollywood makes crap because the traditional financiers know that it works. And so if we can start to work with decentralized systems on new economics and how we finance even the work that we're doing, no more grants from the whatever, for the artists, I say that, then we will truly start to resolve this, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Can I defend Hollywood?
What's that?
Can I defend Hollywood?
Absolutely.
I think they are pretty good in telling stories, and we have to use the same tools. We have to tell also emotional stories, things people want to listen to and people want to see. I mean, don't blame Hollywood. Blame other people who tell bad stories and have bad tools and are boring. Sorry to say that, but I mean, that's exactly what we have to do. Yeah, we have to be the new Hollywood.
And I would argue that that's actually, I have to say, I do kind of think that's happening. I mean, there's some really interesting coming at it from the side projects that are out there that I don't think any of us would have imagined being made 10 years ago, 20 years ago at all. And 50 years ago, people would have lost their minds. I mean, I do know that
blockbusters. We need blockbusters from the good people have to make blockbusters.
Yeah. Well, the pressure's on you guys. I'm just going to write about it.
Yes, I just want to reference your earlier point, Charlotte, about the different mediums. And I really love movies and I really love the storytelling potential of them. But I'm playing in a totally different medium in the sense of I'm playing with legal tools. We're trying to build these things that in a sense tell the story by doing it. But then we've got policymakers who are telling their stories through making policies, and and then we've got earlier on today in the session with Jennifer, we had somebody who written a scenario who's working on games and role-playing games, and just the entire nature of how games have just generated these entirely different ways of creating narratives. I think multiplying these different kinds of media, as well as multiplying the different narratives and voices that we're getting to hear from, I think is part of this sort of theme of multiplying utopias that I think Jennifer, Primavera and I were playing on in our workshops. But I think it also speaks to that broader notion of, can we create a storytelling commons in a sense that is very different fundamentally from the business models of a traditional centralized status quo institutional authority, we tell you what to think approach, and really embrace what decentralization means in terms of redistribution of agency and the authority in the sense of I have the ability and voice to tell a story. And I think, interestingly, just to bring in at the end this sort of Asian perspective, because I bridge this East-West perspective to some extent, a lot of my Asian friends look in admiration at the capacity of Western people brought up in the Western education system to tell their own story. That's something that's so baked into the assumptions that I think Western education creates for you, that we forget that this whole notion of having the ability and even having the gumption to think that you can tell a story for yourself and not have it handed to you is not by any means even the remotest bit widespread. And so I think when we talk about how we open up the worlds of world making and make it a public sort of fora, and think about the different media we can use, I think there's a huge amount of open space to do that, and I think collaboration really is the only way that we're going to rapidly fill that open space.
Well, I don't think I could end on a better note, so thank you, Tony. rock. And I am so grateful for all of you for finding the time, for having this conversation, that even though it was one of the longer panels at Radical Exchange was still too short. There are so many other questions that I'm sure the audience has for each of you specifically, as well as a group. And so I would just encourage the audience to reach out. This is a group of artists and designers and thinkers and practitioners who clearly have a dedication to understanding different thoughts and approaches. And so one of the reasons we have conferences like this is so that you can reach out and connect with people. So I would just encourage you to do that. And with that, thank you, everyone. And I'll see you on the other side.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.